What happens when a dog adopts a wild fox? Eleanor's German Shepherd finds an orphaned fox pup, forming an unthinkable bond that divides an entire town. Subscribe now and comment where you're watching from. The morning sun crept through the lace curtains of Eleanor Caldwell's farmhouse, casting dappled patterns across her worn oak dining table. At 68, with silver hair always neatly pinned in a loose bun, Eleanor had settled into the quiet rhythm of retirement after 37 years teaching literature at Mapleton High. The small Midwestern town of Mapleton, population 2,743, was the kind of place where grocery trips took twice as long due to inevitable conversations, and where 3 generations of families occupied the same church pews every Sunday. Eleanor sipped her Earl Grey tea, gazing out at the sprawling fields that surrounded her century-old farmhouse. The property had been in her late husband Robert's family for 4 generations. 5 years after his passing, she still sometimes set 2 mugs on the counter each morning out of habit. "Duke," she called, realizing her companion wasn't at his usual spot by her feet. The 7-year-old German Shepherd usually never left her side in the mornings. "Duke." Setting down her mug, Eleanor pulled her cardigan tighter against the early spring chill and stepped onto the back porch. The April air carried the scent of damp earth and new growth. Her eyes scanned the property until she spotted Duke at the edge of the garden, his powerful body curled around something near the old maple tree. "What you got there, boy?" she called, but the dog didn't respond. Unusual for Duke, whose training had always been impeccable. As Eleanor approached, Duke's head snapped up, his amber eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her pause. Then she heard it, a small, pitiful whimper coming from beneath his protective stance. "Easy now," she murmured, taking another step forward. To her shock, Duke let out a low, warning growl. In 7 years, he had never once growled at her. "Duke." The dog's posture softened slightly at her voice, but he remained firmly positioned, protecting whatever lay beneath him. Eleanor crouched down, her knees protesting, and peered at the small, trembling ball of orange-red fur. "Oh my goodness," she whispered. A tiny fox pup, no larger than a kitten, was curled against Duke's warm body. Its eyes were barely open, its breathing rapid and shallow. As Eleanor extended her hand, Duke growled again, more insistently. "I won't hurt it, I promise," she said softly, but Duke wasn't convinced. The behavior was so unlike him that tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes. Duke had been devastated 2 years ago when the litter he'd sired with the neighbor's German Shepherd had all died from a rare canine virus. The veterinarian had said Duke had fallen into a depression afterward. "You're protecting it, aren't you?" she said, her voice cracking with emotion. The fox pup let out another weak cry, and Duke immediately began licking it gently, warming it with his tongue. Eleanor backed away slowly. "Stay with your friend. I'll be right back." Inside, she frantically dialed Dr. Harris's number. Thomas Harris had been Mapleton's only veterinarian for 20 years, a kind man with perpetually disheveled hair who had helped deliver Duke. "Tom, it's Eleanor Caldwell. I need you to come out to the farm right away. Duke's found a fox pup, and he won't let me near it. I've never seen him like this." "A fox pup?" Dr. Harris's voice sharpened with interest. "That's unusual. They rarely come this close to human settlements. I'll be there in 15 minutes. Eleanor paced by the window, watching Duke, who hadn't moved an inch, his body still curled protectively around the tiny creature. Something about the scene made her chest tighten. After losing Robert, Duke had become her whole world, and seeing him suddenly focused on something else stirred complicated emotions within her. When Dr. Harris's truck rumbled up the gravel driveway, Eleanor rushed out to meet him. "It's the strangest thing, Tom," she said, leading him toward the maple tree. "He won't let me touch it, and Duke has never even growled at me before." Dr. Harris approached cautiously, medical bag in hand. "Hey there, Duke," he called softly. "Remember me, buddy? I'm here to help." Duke's ears perked up at the familiar voice, but his protective stance didn't waver. Dr. Harris crouched down several feet away, assessing the situation. "Eleanor," he said quietly, "I think we're witnessing something remarkable. Let me try something." The vet slowly placed his bag on the ground and sat cross-legged in the grass, making no move toward Duke or the pup. After several minutes of complete stillness, Duke's posture relaxed slightly. "Good boy," Dr. Harris murmured. You're doing a wonderful job protecting that little one. Dr. Harris maintained his patient position on the grass, his weathered face showing no sign of impatience as he and Duke engaged in a silent negotiation. Eleanor watched from a few paces back, clutching her cardigan around her slender frame. The morning dew had soaked through her garden clogs, but she barely noticed. After what seemed like an eternity, Duke lowered his head and made a soft whining sound. Dr. Harris took this as permission and inched forward, speaking in low, soothing tones. "That's it, Duke. I just want to help your little friend." When he was finally within arm's reach, Dr. Harris slowly extended his hand, palm down, allowing Duke to sniff it. The German Shepherd's dark eyes remained intensely focused, but he didn't growl again. With extraordinary gentleness, the vet reached for the fox pup. "Let me see, buddy," he whispered. The moment Dr. Harris lifted the tiny creature, Duke stood up, alert and anxious, his body tense but not aggressive. The fox pup let out a weak cry that seemed to pierce Eleanor's heart. In the full morning light, she could see how truly fragile it was. Ribs visible beneath matted orange fur, eyes crusted, limbs trembling. "Oh, Tom," Eleanor gasped. Dr. Harris cradled the pup in one large hand while checking its vitals with the other. His expression grew increasingly grim as he examined the tiny animal. When he looked up at Eleanor, she was startled to see tears gathering in the corners of his eyes. "What is it?" she asked, alarmed. Dr. Harris cleared his throat, clearly struggling to maintain his professional composure. "This little one is severely malnourished and dehydrated. Probably abandoned or orphaned. But that's not what's getting to me, Eleanor." He glanced at Duke, who hadn't taken his eyes off the pup. "Remember 2 years ago? Duke's litter?" Eleanor nodded, the memory still painful. Duke had been selected to sire puppies with James Miller's prize German Shepherd. Everyone in town had been excited about the litter. Duke's intelligence and temperament were legendary in Mapleton. When all 7 puppies died from a rare virus, Duke had changed. The playful spark in his eyes dimmed, and he became more solemn, more attached to Eleanor. "I think," Dr. Harris said softly, "we're seeing a father who never got to be one." Eleanor felt her eyes fill with tears as she watched Duke pacing anxiously, his gaze never leaving the pup. "Is it going to survive?" she asked. "Hard to say," Dr. Harris admitted. "But if we don't intervene, definitely not. This little girl needs fluids, warmth, and special formula right away." "It's a female?" Eleanor asked, somehow finding this detail important. Dr. Harris nodded. "A female red fox, probably around 3 weeks old. Far too young to be without her mother." Eleanor made a decision immediately. "What do we need to do?" Dr. Harris looked up in surprise. "Eleanor, this is a wild animal. Even if we save her, she can't be a pet. She'll have wild instincts, needs that domestic animals don't have." "I understand that," Eleanor said firmly. "But Duke doesn't, and I won't take this away from him. Not after everything he's been through. We'll figure out the rest later." Dr. Harris studied her face, then nodded slowly. "All right, let's get this little one inside. I have some supplies in my truck, but I'll need to go back to the clinic for more." As they stood up, Duke began to whine anxiously. "It's okay, boy," Eleanor soothed. "We're helping her. Come along." To their relief, Duke followed them toward the house, his eyes never leaving the tiny bundle in Dr. Harris's hands. In Eleanor's warm kitchen, Dr. Harris administered subcutaneous fluids while Eleanor heated water bottles and gathered soft towels. Duke paced nervously, occasionally pressing his nose against the pup to check on her. "You'll need to feed her every 3 hours, including through the night," Dr. Harris explained as he showed Eleanor how to prepare the special formula. "She's going to need constant care for at least a few weeks. Like having a newborn again," Eleanor murmured, remembering those sleepless nights with her son, Michael, who now lived in Seattle with his wife and 2 children. "Exactly," Dr. Harris confirmed. "And Eleanor, there's something else you should know. It's unusual for fox pups to be found alone this close to town. Foxes are naturally wary of human settlements." Eleanor frowned. "What are you saying?" "Something might have happened to disrupt her natural habitat. There have been reports of illegal hunting in the woods beyond your property. Sheriff Goodwin mentioned it at the town council meeting last week." Duke let out a low growl, as if understanding the threat being discussed. "Those woods have been a protected area for decades," Eleanor said, indignant. "Robert used to photograph wildlife there. Who would dare hunt illegally?" Dr. Harris shrugged. Hard to say, but it's concerning for the local ecosystem. After Dr. Harris left with promises to return the next day, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, watching Duke curl protectively around the sleeping pup on a bed of towels she'd arranged by the wood stove. "What should we call her?" she asked Duke softly. The dog's ears perked up at her voice, but his body remained wrapped around his charge. In the warm light of the kitchen, the pup's fur glowed a rich orange red. "How about Amber?" Eleanor suggested. "For her beautiful color." Duke's tail thumped once against the floor, approval. Eleanor's phone rang, startling her. It was Margaret Green, her closest friend since college and fellow retired teacher. "Eleanor, I just ran into Tom Harris at the general store. Is it true? You're raising a fox pup?" Eleanor sighed. In Mapleton, news traveled faster than light. "It's complicated, Margaret. Duke found her, and he's attached. You should see him with her. It's like he's found a purpose again." "Well, I think it's wonderful," Margaret declared. "But not everyone will feel that way." Edward Johnson was in the store too, and he didn't look pleased when Tom mentioned it. Eleanor frowned. Edward Johnson owned the largest farm adjacent to her property and had been trying to convince her to sell to him for years. His factory farming methods contrasted sharply with Robert's commitment to the land's natural balance. "Edward Johnson can mind his own business," Eleanor said firmly. "This little one needs help, and that's that." As she hung up the phone, Eleanor gazed at Duke and Amber. Outside her window, the vast Midwestern sky was turning pink with sunset, illuminating fields that stretched toward distant woods. She knew Margaret was right. Not everyone would understand. But watching Duke tenderly nuzzle the sleeping fox pup, Eleanor felt certain she was doing the right thing, whatever challenges lay ahead. The Mapleton General Store had served as the town's unofficial news hub since 1923. Its worn wooden floors had witnessed generations of gossip, celebration, and controversy. By 9 o'clock the morning after Amber's discovery, the store buzzed with animated conversations, all centered on Eleanor Caldwell's unusual new house guest. Behind the worn counter, Betty Jenkins, proprietor for 35 years, listened with undisguised interest as Margaret Green defended her friend's decision. "Eleanor has the kindest heart in Mapleton," Margaret insisted, her silver bob swinging emphatically. "If anyone can help that poor creature, it's her." Edward Johnson scoffed, his weathered face creasing into a scowl. At 63, he represented the third generation of Johnson farmers, known for their massive corn and soybean operation that employed a quarter of the town. "Kindness has nothing to do with it," he countered, leaning on his shopping cart. "Wild animals belong in the wild. Period. That fox will grow up to be a predator. It's in their nature. What happens when it starts going after my chickens? Or worse, when it attracts more foxes to the area?" The bell above the door jingled as Sheriff Ray Goodwin entered, instantly noting the charged atmosphere. At 51, with salt and pepper hair and a perpetually tired expression, Goodwin had maintained peace in Mapleton for 15 years. "Morning, folks," he nodded. "Betty, got any of that coffee left?" "Fresh pot, Ray," Betty replied, grateful for the interruption. "Sugar, no cream, right?" "You know me too well." Goodwin smiled, then turned to address the elephant in the room. "I take it you're all discussing Eleanor's situation?" "Situation is right," Johnson muttered. "There are ordinances against keeping wild animals, aren't there, Sheriff?" Goodwin accepted his coffee with a nod of thanks. "It's not that simple, Ed. There are exceptions for wildlife rehabilitation, and Dr. Harris is involved, which makes it legitimate medical care. Rehabilitation implies the animal will be released eventually," Johnson pressed. Margaret crossed her arms, which I'm sure is exactly what Eleanor intends to do when the time is right. Meanwhile, at the farmhouse, Eleanor was experiencing her first full day of fox puppy parenthood. She had barely slept, setting alarms every 3 hours to feed Amber the special formula Dr. Harris had provided. Duke had remained vigilant all night, only leaving Amber's side when Eleanor approached with food. "You're a natural, boy," Eleanor murmured as she watched Duke gently clean Amber after her morning feeding. The pup's condition had improved overnight, her breathing steadier, her tiny body warmer to the touch. When Amber opened her eyes fully for the first time, Eleanor gasped at their amber gold color, so similar to Duke's. The pup made a small squeaking sound, and Duke immediately responded with a soft whine, licking her face reassuringly. The ringing phone interrupted the tender moment. Eleanor answered to hear Dr. Harris's voice. "How's our patient this morning?" "Better, I think," Eleanor replied. "Her eyes are open, and she took all her formula." "Excellent. Listen, Eleanor," his tone shifted. "I wanted to warn you. There's quite a discussion happening in town about your situation." Edward Johnson was asking Sheriff Goodwin about wildlife ordinances. Eleanor felt a flare of irritation. That man never could mind his own business. "I defended you, of course," Dr. Harris continued. "But you should prepare yourself. This might become contentious." After hanging up, Eleanor knelt beside Duke and Amber. "Looks like we've stirred up the hornet's nest, you two." Duke looked up at her with soulful eyes, as if understanding perfectly. The doorbell rang just after noon. Eleanor opened the door to find Margaret on her porch, arms laden with grocery bags. "I figured you could use some supplies," Margaret explained, bustling past Eleanor into the kitchen. "And I wanted to see this miracle for myself." Eleanor led her friend to the living room where Duke and Amber were resting. Margaret's hand flew to her chest at the sight of the huge German Shepherd curled protectively around the tiny fox pup. "Oh, Eleanor," she whispered. "It's even more remarkable than I imagined, isn't it?" Eleanor agreed softly. "He won't leave her side. It's like he's been waiting for her." Margaret settled into Robert's old armchair, her eyes never leaving the unusual pair. "The town's in quite a state over this. Edward Johnson is on his high horse about wildlife regulations." Eleanor snorted. "Edward Johnson has been trying to get my land since Robert passed. He'd use any excuse to make trouble for me." "It's not just Edward," Margaret cautioned. "Some folks are genuinely concerned about having a wild predator being raised near town. Others worry about the precedent it sets." "And what do you think?" Eleanor asked, studying her oldest friend's face. Margaret didn't hesitate. "I think there are moments in life when the rules need to bend for compassion. This is one of those moments." The women were interrupted by Duke's sudden alertness. His ears pricked forward, body tensing. A moment later, they heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Eleanor peeked through the curtains and groaned. Speaking of Edward Johnson. Outside, Edward's massive pickup truck had pulled to a stop. He emerged wearing his usual flannel shirt and work jeans, his expression grim as he approached the porch. "I'll handle this," Eleanor said, squaring her shoulders. She opened the door before Edward could knock. "Edward," she greeted coolly. "What brings you by?" "You know exactly why I'm here, Eleanor," he replied, not bothering with pleasantries. "Word is you've taken in a wild fox." "That's correct," Eleanor confirmed. "A pup that would have died without intervention." Edward's jaw tightened. "You know my chickens are just over the property line. Foxes are natural predators. This predator is currently the size of a coffee mug and can barely open her eyes," Eleanor retorted. "I think your chickens are safe for now. And later? When it grows? When it attracts others?" Edward demanded. "Have you thought about the consequences for the rest of us?" From inside, Duke's deep bark resonated, clearly agitated by the confrontational tone. "I understand your concerns," Eleanor said, striving to keep her voice even. "But this is my property, and Dr. Harris is overseeing Amber's care as a wildlife rehabilitation case." "Amber," Edward scoffed. "You've named it? That's not rehabilitation, Eleanor. That's domestication. I think you should leave now," Eleanor said firmly. Edward's eyes narrowed. "This isn't over. That animal is a threat to my livelihood." "Goodbye, Edward," Eleanor said, closing the door despite his protests. Inside, she found Duke standing protectively in front of the makeshift bed where Amber lay, his hackles raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. "It's okay, boy," Eleanor soothed, kneeling beside him. "No one is going to harm either of you." Margaret watched the scene with concern. "Edward won't let this go easily. He's got influence in this town." Eleanor stroked Duke's head, feeling the tension in his powerful body. "Then we'd better be prepared to fight," she said quietly. "Because I won't abandon her either." As if understanding, Duke relaxed slightly under her touch, turning to check on Amber, who had begun to stir. The tiny fox pup yawned, showing a pink tongue and needle-sharp teeth, a reminder of her wild nature despite her vulnerable state. Outside, the spring breeze carried Edward Johnson's truck dust away as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, mirroring the conflict brewing in the once peaceful town of Mapleton. 3 weeks passed in a blur of feedings, cleanings, and sleepless nights. Eleanor settled into a routine that revolved entirely around Amber's care, with Duke as her steadfast assistant. The tiny fox pup had transformed remarkably. Her fur now gleamed a vibrant orange-red. Her eyes were bright and alert, and her wobbly legs had strengthened enough for her first tentative explorations of Eleanor's living room. On this particular morning, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, nursing a strong cup of coffee, while watching Duke herd Amber back toward their shared bed whenever the curious pup strayed too far. "She's getting bolder by the day," Eleanor remarked to Dr. Harris, who had stopped by for his bi-weekly checkup. The veterinarian nodded, jotting notes in Amber's medical file. "She's thriving, Eleanor. You and Duke have done an incredible job." Eleanor smiled tiredly. The constant care had taken its toll. Her usually tidy house now contained makeshift barricades. Her sleep came in 3-hour increments, and her social life had dwindled to Margaret's daily visits and Dr. Harris's checkups. Yet she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt so purposeful, so needed. "What happens next, Tom?" she asked, voicing the question that had been weighing on her mind. "She's getting more active, more curious. This house won't contain her forever." Dr. Harris set down his pen, choosing his words carefully. "That's the challenge with wildlife rehabilitation. The goal should always be to prepare them for eventual release." "Release," Eleanor repeated, the word catching in her throat. She glanced at Duke, who had flopped down beside Amber, watching contentedly as the pup pawed at his tail. "I'm not sure Duke would understand that concept." "It's a delicate balance," Dr. Harris admitted. "Right now, she still needs you both. But as she grows, we'll need to start introducing more natural behaviors, less human interaction." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Duke immediately stood at attention, positioning himself between Amber and the potential threat. Eleanor opened the door to find Sheriff Goodwin on her porch, his official hat in his hands, a sign this wasn't a casual visit. "Morning, Eleanor," he said, his expression apologetic. "Mind if I come in?" Eleanor led him to the kitchen, where Dr. Harris greeted the sheriff with a concerned nod. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call, Ray," Eleanor said, offering coffee which Goodwin declined. "Afraid not," he sighed, settling his large frame onto a kitchen chair. "The town council held a special meeting yesterday about your situation." "My situation has a name," Eleanor said pointedly. "It's Amber." As if summoned, the fox pup came trotting into the kitchen, followed closely by Duke. Goodwin's eyebrows rose as he watched the German shepherd gently nudge Amber away from the unfamiliar visitor. "Well, I'll be," he murmured. Tom wasn't exaggerating. "What did the council decide?" Dr. Harris asked, bringing the conversation back to its purpose. Goodwin shifted uncomfortably. "They're divided. Edward Johnson has submitted a formal complaint citing the wildlife ordinance. He's demanding the fox be transferred to a licensed wildlife rehabilitation center immediately." Eleanor felt her chest tighten. "And the other side?" Mayor Williams and half the council argue that since Dr. Harris is providing oversight, this qualifies as legitimate rehabilitation. Goodwin sighed. "They've scheduled a public hearing for next Monday to resolve the matter." "A public hearing?" Eleanor repeated incredulously. "Over a baby fox?" "Over community standards and wildlife regulations," Goodwin corrected gently. Edwards gathered quite a following. Mostly farmers worried about their livestock and parents concerned about wild predators near children. Eleanor knelt to stroke Duke's head, her mind racing. "And if they rule against us?" Goodwin and Dr. Harris exchanged glances. "State law would require Amber to be transferred to the Wildlife Center in Springfield," the sheriff explained. "It's a good facility, but they don't have Duke," Eleanor finished, her voice barely audible. After Goodwin left, Dr. Harris helped Eleanor prepare Amber's midday formula. "The hearing might not be a bad thing," he offered. "It gives us a chance to educate the community. Or it gives Edward Johnson a platform to spread fear," Eleanor countered. "Then we'd better be prepared," Dr. Harris said firmly. "I'll bring my research on interspecies bonding. We'll need to prove this arrangement benefits Amber's development." Later that afternoon, Eleanor sat on her back porch watching Duke guide Amber through the fenced garden area. The pup was becoming more coordinated, occasionally pouncing on insects or leaves that caught her attention. Duke observed with what Eleanor could only describe as paternal pride, intervening only when Amber strayed toward the fence line. The sound of tires on gravel announced another visitor. Eleanor was relieved to see Margaret's sedan pull up beside Dr. Harris's truck, which he'd left while running into town for supplies. "I came as soon as I heard," Margaret called, hurrying up the path with a casserole dish in hand. "The whole town's talking about this hearing." Eleanor accepted the dish gratefully. "I should have expected Edward to make this official. He's been going door to door," Margaret reported, settling beside Eleanor on the porch swing, showing people pictures of fox attacks on chickens from some farming magazine. "Typical," Eleanor muttered, fear-mongering instead of understanding. They watched in companionable silence as Amber attempted to climb onto a garden stone, tumbled over, then tried again with determined focus. "She's a fighter," Margaret observed. "Like someone else I know." Eleanor smiled wryly. "Robert always said I was too stubborn for my own good." "He also said it was your best quality," Margaret reminded her. "Remember when the school board wanted to cut the arts program? You single-handedly organized the town to save it." "This is different," Eleanor sighed. "This is about Duke and Amber, not me." Margaret took her friend's hand. "Is it?" "Eleanor, I've known you for 40 years. Since Robert died, you've been existing, not living. This is the first time I've seen that fire in your eyes again." Eleanor watched as Duke gently picked Amber up by the scruff when she ventured too close to the vegetable garden. The pup dangled comically before being deposited on safer ground. "They need each other," Eleanor said softly. "Duke lost his puppies, his chance to be a father. And Amber lost her mother, her home. They're healing each other." "Then that's what we'll tell the town," Margaret declared. "Mapleton has always valued compassion. We just need to remind them." That evening, after Margaret left and Dr. Harris returned with supplies, Eleanor sat at her desk crafting a statement for the hearing. Outside, a spring storm rolled across the prairie, thunder rumbling in the distance. Amber, still skittish around loud noises, pressed closer to Duke, who responded by curling his body more protectively around her. Eleanor watched them from across the room, struck by how their relationship had evolved. Duke still groomed and protected Amber, but now he also disciplined her, nudging her away from forbidden areas, carrying her back when she strayed too far. For her part, Amber had begun mimicking Duke's behaviors, attempting to howl when he barked at passing cars, watching intently when he patrolled the yard perimeter. As lightning flashed, illuminating the cozy scene, Eleanor felt a profound certainty. Whatever the town decided, these two beings had formed a bond that transcended natural order. They had chosen each other against all odds, creating their own definition of family. "We'll fight for you," she promised them quietly. "Both of you." In the distance, thunder rumbled again, a fitting drum roll for the battle that lay ahead in the once peaceful town of Mapleton, where nature and humanity were about to face off over the fate of an unlikely family. The Mapleton Community Center had never seen such a crowd. By 6:30 Monday evening, every folding chair was occupied, forcing latecomers to stand along the wood-paneled walls. The room, usually reserved for bingo nights and community suppers, hummed with anticipation. On one side sat Eleanor, flanked by Margaret and Dr. Harris, with several of her former students scattered supportively nearby. Across the aisle, Edward Johnson had assembled an equally impressive contingent of farmers and concerned parents. Mayor Dennis Williams, a round-faced man with perpetually rolled-up shirt sleeves, called the meeting to order precisely at 7. At 65, he'd governed Mapleton for nearly 2 decades with a reputation for fairness and pragmatism. "Folks," he began, his deep voice cutting through the chatter, "I want to remind everyone that we're here to have a civilized discussion about a matter that clearly means a great deal to this community. I expect respectful behavior from all parties." He adjusted his reading glasses. "We're here to address concerns regarding Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell's rehabilitation of a wild fox on her property. The council will hear arguments from both sides before making a determination." Eleanor sat straight-backed in her chair, the statement she'd prepared trembling slightly in her hands. She'd left Duke and Amber in the care of Michael's college friend, Jake Barnes, who ran the local hardware store and had offered his support. The separation made her anxious, but bringing Amber would have been too stressful for everyone involved. "Mr. Johnson, as the complainant, you may speak first," Mayor Williams directed. Edward Johnson approached the podium with confident strides. At 6'2" with broad shoulders from decades of farm work, he cut an imposing figure. "Thank you, Mayor, council members, neighbors," he began, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I'm not here tonight out of any personal vendetta. I'm here because what's happening at the Caldwell farm sets a dangerous precedent for our community." He produced several glossy photographs, holding them up for the crowd to see. These are red foxes in their natural state, wild predators that can destroy livestock, carry diseases, and threaten the safety of our children. The Wildlife Ordinance exists for good reason. Johnson's voice hardened. "Mrs. Caldwell may have good intentions, but she's not a licensed wildlife rehabilitator. This fox, regardless of how cute it might appear now, will grow into a predator with natural instincts that can't be trained away. By keeping it in a domestic setting, she's delaying its proper development and potentially endangering our community." His gaze swept the room. "I'm simply asking that we follow the law. The fox should be transferred to professionals at the Springfield Wildlife Center, where it can be properly prepared for release into a suitable habitat, far from our farms and homes." Edward returned to his seat amid supportive nods from his faction. Mayor Williams then called Eleanor forward. Eleanor approached the podium slowly, keenly aware of every eye in the room. She'd taught many of these people, or their children, during her long career. She took a deep breath and set aside her prepared statement. "I've lived in Mapleton for 45 years, she began, her teacher's voice clear and steady. "In that time, I've come to understand that this community values two things above all: compassion and common sense. Tonight, I'm asking you to use both." She looked directly at Edward. "Yes, Amber is a wild animal. Yes, she will grow to be a fox with natural instincts. I've never denied these facts or intended to keep her as a pet indefinitely." Eleanor turned back to the wider audience. "But there are extraordinary circumstances here that warrant special consideration. 3 weeks ago, my German Shepherd, Duke, found this orphan pup and formed an immediate bond with her. As many of you know, Duke lost his own litter 2 years ago to disease. Dr. Harris believes Duke's paternal instincts were triggered by this vulnerable orphan." Her voice softened. "What we're witnessing is a remarkable case of interspecies adoption, something that occasionally happens in the wild when circumstances bring together animals that would normally avoid each other." Dr. Harris stood and approached the podium, standing beside Eleanor. "If I may, Mayor, I'd like to provide some medical context." At the mayor's nod, Dr. Harris continued. "From a veterinary perspective, Amber's development has been exceptional under Duke's care. He's teaching her appropriate boundaries, encouraging natural behaviors, and providing the socialization she needs at this crucial stage. Moving her now could be traumatic for both animals." Eleanor smiled gratefully at Dr. Harris before continuing. "We're not asking for permanent custody. When Amber is ready, we fully intend to work with wildlife experts on an appropriate release plan. But forcing a separation now, when she's still so dependent on Duke's guidance, would be harmful to her development." From the back of the room, Sheriff Goodwin spoke up. "Mayor, if I could add something?" At Williams' nod, he continued. "We've had reports of increased illegal hunting activity in the protected woods beyond Mrs. Caldwell's property. It's likely why this fox pup was orphaned in the first place. Until we address that issue, returning any wildlife to that area would be irresponsible." A murmur ran through the crowd. Eleanor hadn't expected this support from the sheriff and felt a surge of gratitude. Edward Johnson stood again. "With all due respect, Sheriff, that's speculation. And it doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Caldwell lacks the proper licensing for wildlife rehabilitation." "Actually," Dr. Harris interjected, "under state law, a licensed veterinarian can designate a temporary wildlife caregiver in special circumstances. I've already filed that paperwork designating Eleanor as Amber's caregiver under my supervision." Edward's face flushed. "This is exactly the kind of exception that undermines our regulations. What's next? Mountain lions in the backyard? Bears in the garage?" "That's quite enough, Edward," Mayor Williams said firmly. "Let's stick to the matter at hand." The mayor turned to the audience. "Would anyone else like to speak on this issue?" To Eleanor's surprise, Jacob Miller, owner of the local grocery store and father of 3 young children, stood up. He was firmly in Edward's camp, or so she had thought. "I came here tonight planning to side with Edward," Jacob admitted. "As a parent, the idea of a wild predator being raised near town made me nervous." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. But listening to Eleanor and Dr. Harris reminds me of something my grandfather used to say. Nature has its own wisdom that sometimes defies our rules. If this dog and fox have formed a bond that's helping both of them heal, who are we to interfere based on our fears of what might happen? Another voice joined in. Lisa Patel, who ran the town's small veterinary supply store. I've seen Duke with Amber. It's not just Eleanor's interpretation. Anyone who observes them can see their connection. And Duke is teaching the fox appropriate behaviors. He actually disciplines her when she gets too aggressive or ventures into prohibited areas. One by one, more townspeople stood to offer their perspectives. The tide seemed to be turning in Eleanor's favor, though Edward's supporters remained vocal about their concerns regarding safety and precedent. After nearly 2 hours of testimony, Mayor Williams called for a brief recess so the council could deliberate. Eleanor stepped outside for fresh air, her nerves frayed from the emotional roller coaster of the evening. Margaret followed her out. "You were magnificent in there," she said, squeezing Eleanor's hand. "It doesn't matter how I performed," Eleanor replied, gazing up at the star-filled sky. "All that matters is what's best for Amber and Duke." Dr. Harris joined them, his expression cautiously optimistic. "The council seems receptive to our arguments." Sheriff Goodwin's support was unexpected but helpful. When the meeting reconvened, the community center fell silent as Mayor Williams cleared his throat. After careful consideration, the council has reached a decision. While we acknowledge the concerns raised by Mr. Johnson regarding wildlife regulations, we also recognize the unique circumstances in this case. Eleanor held her breath as the mayor continued. "Therefore, we propose the following compromise. Mrs. Caldwell may continue as Amber's primary caregiver under Dr. Harris's professional supervision for a period not to exceed 6 months. During this time, a transition plan must be developed for Amber's eventual release or transfer to a permanent wildlife facility. Additionally, representatives from the State Wildlife Department will conduct monthly evaluations to ensure appropriate progress toward rehabilitation." The mayor looked directly at Eleanor. "Mrs. Caldwell, do you find these terms acceptable?" Eleanor stood, her heart pounding. "Yes, Mayor. Thank you." "Mr. Johnson, while this may not be the outcome you sought, the council believes this compromise upholds the spirit of our wildlife ordinances while acknowledging the exceptional circumstances. Do you have any further objections?" Edward's jaw tightened visibly, but he merely shook his head. "Then this meeting is adjourned," Mayor Williams declared, bringing down his gavel. As people filed out of the community center, some stopped to offer Eleanor words of support, while others still regarded her with skepticism. Edward Johnson brushed past without acknowledgement, his disappointment evident in his rigid posture. Outside in the cool spring evening, Eleanor took a deep breath of relief. They had won, not completely but enough. 6 months would give Amber time to grow stronger, and for Duke to continue his unlikely mentorship. "Let's go home," she said to Margaret and Dr. Harris. "I have a feeling those two are wondering where I've been." As they drove through the quiet streets of Mapleton, Eleanor gazed out at the familiar landscape, transformed by moonlight. The town might be divided now, but she believed in her neighbors' capacity for understanding. Eventually, they would see what she already knew, that sometimes the most profound connections defy our expectations, crossing boundaries we once thought impermeable. What mattered now was the precious time they had been granted, 6 months to help Amber grow, to let Duke fulfill his paternal destiny, and perhaps to heal a divided town in the process. The late May morning sparkled with promise as Eleanor sipped her coffee on the back porch. The eastern sun cast long shadows across her property, dew still clinging to the grass in the shaded areas. In the 7 weeks since Amber had arrived, spring had fully blossomed into early summer, painting Eleanor's 5 acres with wildflowers and fresh growth. She watched with amusement as Duke and Amber explored the perimeter of the newly constructed enclosure, a spacious outdoor habitat that Dr. Harris had helped design following the town council's decision. Built to satisfy both the State Wildlife Department's requirements and Amber's growing need for a more natural environment, the enclosure encompassed a wooded corner of Eleanor's property with bushes, logs, and a small artificial den. At 12 weeks old, Amber had transformed from the frail, trembling pup into a vibrant, curious juvenile fox. Her russet coat gleamed with health, her once uncertain movements now quick and confident as she darted between shrubs, practicing pounces and stalking techniques with an instinctive grace that sometimes took Eleanor's breath away. "She's getting faster," Eleanor remarked to Duke, who sat attentively beside her chair. The German shepherd's ears perked forward at the mention of his charge, his intelligent eyes tracking Amber's movements with that same mixture of pride and protectiveness that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. Eleanor reached down to scratch behind Duke's ears. "You've been a wonderful teacher, old friend." As if understanding the compliment, Duke's tail swept once across the porch boards before he stood, suddenly alert. A moment later, Eleanor heard the sound that had caught his attention: tires on the gravel driveway. Dr. Harris's familiar truck came into view, followed by an unfamiliar government vehicle bearing the State Wildlife Department logo. Eleanor straightened her blouse and ran a quick hand through her silver hair. These monthly evaluations still made her nervous, despite the fact that the wildlife officials had been impressed with Amber's progress so far. "Good morning, Eleanor," Dr. Harris called, emerging from his truck with a leather medical bag. "Hope we're not too early." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, setting down her coffee cup. "We were just watching Amber's morning exercises." From the government vehicle emerged Dr. Lydia Chun, the wildlife biologist assigned to Amber's case. In her mid-40s with practical short-cropped hair and perpetually muddy field boots, Dr. Chun had initially approached the situation with professional skepticism, but had gradually warmed to the unusual arrangement. "Mrs. Caldwell," she nodded in greeting. "How has our patient been this past week?" "See for yourself." Eleanor smiled, gesturing toward the enclosure where Amber was now attempting to dig beneath a fallen log, her white-tipped tail straight up in concentration. Dr. Chin pulled out a tablet and began taking notes. "Her coat looks excellent. Any changes in feeding behavior?" "She's taking more interest in the live prey items you suggested," Eleanor reported. "Earthworms, crickets. She caught a field mouse on her own yesterday." Dr. Chin looked up sharply, her expression brightening with professional interest. "Did she? That's significant progress. How did Duke react to that?" It was a pertinent question. The delicate balance in their unusual relationship had shifted as Amber's predatory instincts emerged. Eleanor had worried that Duke might become confused or distressed by these behaviors, so at odds with his domestic nature. Actually, Eleanor said, he seemed proud. He watched her stalk it, didn't interfere, and then sat back when she made the catch. Almost like a coach observing a student. Dr. Chun made additional notes, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Fascinating. And her interaction with humans?" "Minimal, as you recommended. I only enter the enclosure for feeding and maintenance. She's becoming appropriately wary, keeping her distance unless Duke is between us." Dr. Harris had moved to the enclosure gate, where Duke now waited expectantly. "Shall we have a closer look?" The small group entered the habitat, Duke leading the way with dignified purpose. Amber, spotting the visitors, retreated to the safety of her artificial den, only her bright eyes visible from the shadows. "Good," Dr. Chin murmured. "That's exactly the reaction we want to see with humans she doesn't know well." Dr. Harris conducted a brief visual assessment, noting Amber's clear eyes, healthy coat, and alert posture even in retreat. "She's thriving, Eleanor. You and Duke have done remarkable work." As they completed the examination, a truck engine sounded on the road beyond Eleanor's property. Duke's ears flattened slightly as he moved protectively closer to Amber's den. "That'll be Edward Johnson," Eleanor sighed. "He drives by almost daily now, watching." Dr. Harris frowned. "Still holding a grudge about the council's decision?" "I suspect it's more than that," Eleanor replied quietly. "He's been clearing land right up to our property line all month. Margaret heard at the salon that he's planning a major expansion of his chicken operation." "Directly adjacent to your property?" Dr. Chin asked, her professional demeanor shifting to concern. "That could complicate Amber's rehabilitation. Domestic fowl would be an irresistible temptation for a young fox." The implied threat hung in the air as they exited the enclosure. Once the gate was secured, Duke remained inside, settling himself near Amber's den where the young fox had cautiously emerged again, pressing against his flank. Later that afternoon, after Dr. Harris and Dr. Chun had departed with positive reports, Eleanor received another visitor. Sheriff Goodwin's patrol car pulled up beside the mailbox, and the tall officer ambled up the driveway with his characteristic unhurried gait. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he called, tipping his hat. "Thought I'd stop by with an update you might want to hear." Eleanor invited him onto the porch, offering iced tea, which he accepted gratefully in the growing heat of the day. "We apprehended 2 poachers in the protected forest last night," he reported, settling into a wicker chair. "Found them with illegal traps and a fox carcass." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "Do you think?" "Can't say for certain if they're connected to Amber's situation," Goodwin said carefully. "But they admitted to trapping in that area for months. The evidence has been turned over to the state conservation officers." "Thank you for telling me," Eleanor said quietly, her eyes drifting to the enclosure where Duke and Amber were napping in a patch of dappled sunlight. "There's something else," Goodwin added, his tone more hesitant. "These fellows mentioned they had a buyer for the pelts. Someone local." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Did they say who?" "No names," Goodwin shook his head. "But I thought you should know we're investigating all angles. Illegal wildlife trade is federal territory." After the sheriff left, Eleanor sat alone on the porch, watching the sun begin its westward descent. The peaceful scene before her, her thriving garden, the ancient maple trees, Duke and Amber in their comfortable companionship, contrasted sharply with the undercurrent of threat the sheriff's news had brought. Reaching for her phone, she dialed Margaret's number. Her friend answered on the second ring. "Eleanor, I was just about to call you. How did the evaluation go?" "Very well," Eleanor replied. Dr. Chun was pleased with Amber's progress. "But something else has come up. Sheriff Goodwin just left. They've caught poachers in the protected forest." "Thank goodness," Margaret exclaimed. "Those dreadful people. Do you think they're the ones who—" "Possibly," Eleanor confirmed. "But there's more. They apparently have a local buyer." A beat of silence followed. Then Margaret spoke, her voice lowered as if afraid of being overheard. "You don't think—" "I don't know what to think," Eleanor admitted. "But Edward Johnson has been watching this property like a hawk, and suddenly he's expanding his operation right against my boundary line." "That could be coincidence," Margaret offered, though her tone suggested she didn't believe it. "Perhaps," Eleanor conceded. "But I think we need to keep our eyes open." As twilight descended, Eleanor completed her evening routine, refreshing water dishes, checking the enclosure's security, and preparing Amber's increasingly complex meals. Dr. Chun had provided a feeding regimen that gradually introduced more natural food sources and required more hunting behavior from Amber to obtain them. Duke supervised the process with his usual attentiveness, occasionally communicating with Amber through subtle body language that Eleanor was still learning to interpret. A particular head tilt meant safe, while a stiffened posture signaled caution. Most remarkable was the soft whine he used only with Amber, a sound somewhere between encouragement and instruction. Under the deepening purple sky, Eleanor lingered by the enclosure, reluctant to head inside despite the mosquitoes beginning their evening hunt. Duke and Amber were engaged in what looked remarkably like a hunting lesson. The German shepherd would freeze, pointing toward a rustling in the undergrowth, then look expectantly at Amber. The young fox would then attempt to stalk the source, her technique improving with each try. "You're preparing her, aren't you?" Eleanor murmured, watching the pair with a mixture of pride and melancholy. "You know she'll have to leave someday." The realization both warmed and broke her heart. Duke, driven by instincts she couldn't fully comprehend, was teaching Amber skills she would need to survive without him. He was ensuring her future, even if it meant their eventual separation. As night fell completely, Eleanor finally turned toward the house, leaving the unlikely family to their lessons under the emerging stars. In the distance, a vehicle's headlights swept briefly across her property line before disappearing down the county road. Eleanor paused on her porch steps, gazing into the darkness toward Edward Johnson's property. Something told her their battle wasn't over. It was merely entering a new phase, with higher stakes than a town council meeting could resolve. The summer air carried the sweet scent of honeysuckle mixed with the earthier tones of her vegetable garden. But beneath those familiar fragrances, Eleanor sensed a change coming, as inevitable as Amber's growth, as complex as the bonds being formed and tested on her peaceful farm at the edge of Mapleton. July arrived with a vengeance, bringing heat that shimmered above the cornfields and skies that threatened but rarely delivered the rain Mapleton desperately needed. Eleanor's garden required twice daily watering, the soil cracking around her tomato plants despite her best efforts. On this particular Thursday afternoon, the temperature had climbed past 90 degrees by noon, driving most sensible creatures, human and animal alike, to seek shelter from the punishing sun. Inside the relative cool of her farmhouse, Eleanor examined a map spread across her kitchen table while Margaret fanned herself with a folded newspaper. "He's purchased all this land in the past month?" Eleanor asked, tracing the highlighted boundaries with her finger. Margaret nodded grimly. "My nephew works at the county clerk's office. Edward Johnson has acquired over 200 acres surrounding your property on 3 sides." Eleanor sat back, her expression troubled. "This isn't about chickens or fox rehabilitation anymore. He's trying to isolate my farm. The man's been trying to get his hands on your land since Robert passed," Margaret confirmed. "Your 5 acres sits right in the middle of what could be his largest operation yet." Outside, a sudden bark from Duke drew Eleanor's attention. She moved to the window, squinting against the bright light. In the enclosure, now expanded to include a small section of wooded area, Duke stood at alert. Amber, nearly half-grown at 4 months old, had frozen in mid-stride, her ears swiveled toward the property line. "Something's got them worked up," Eleanor murmured. No sooner had she spoken than the distant sound of heavy machinery reached them, the unmistakable growl of bulldozers and excavation equipment. "Sounds like Edward's starting his construction," Margaret observed, joining Eleanor at the window. Eleanor grabbed her wide-brimmed gardening hat from its hook. "I'm going to see what he's up to." "Eleanor," Margaret cautioned, "perhaps we should call Sheriff Goodwin first." But Eleanor was already heading for the door, determination in every step. "I'm just going to observe, Margaret. Knowledge is power." Outside, the heat enveloped her like a heavy blanket. Eleanor paused at the enclosure, where Duke paced anxiously along the fence line, his attention fixed on the commotion beyond the tree line. "It's all right, boy," she soothed, though in truth, the mechanical sound set her own nerves on edge. Following the property boundary, Eleanor walked toward the noise, Margaret reluctantly trailing behind her. They reached the edge of Eleanor's land, where a split-rail fence marked the division between her property and what had once been the Peterson family farm, now apparently owned by Edward Johnson. What they saw made both women gasp. A team of workers operated heavy machinery, clearing trees and undergrowth from a large section bordering Eleanor's land. Several massive chicken houses were already under construction, their metal frameworks gleaming in the harsh sunlight. "This is much more than an expansion," Margaret whispered. "It's practically an industrial operation." Eleanor's eyes narrowed as she spotted Edward Johnson directing workers near a bulldozer. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, meeting her gaze across the churned earth. After a moment's pause, he approached the property line. "Afternoon, Eleanor," he called, his tone falsely pleasant. "Hot enough for you." "What exactly are you doing, Edward?" Eleanor asked directly, skipping the pretense of neighborly chatter. Edward gestured expansively at the construction site. "Progress, Eleanor. Mapleton Poultry is expanding to meet growing demand. We'll be employing another 20 people by harvest time." "Right on my property line?" Eleanor challenged. "There are 300 acres on the other side of your farm. Why build here?" Edward's smile didn't reach his eyes. Water access, elevation, proximity to the main road, all factors in the decision. Just good business sense. "And nothing to do with making life difficult for me and my rehabilitation project?" Eleanor pressed. Edward's facade slipped slightly. "That fox of yours has 6 more weeks before the council's deadline. After that, it's the Wildlife Center or release. Either way, this won't concern you much longer." Before Eleanor could respond, a truck pulled up carrying sections of tall chain-link fencing. Edward nodded toward it. "Security measures. Can't be too careful with predators in the area." The implication wasn't lost on Eleanor. Amber stays in her enclosure. "She's not a threat to your operation." "For now," Edward agreed coldly. "But foxes have a way of multiplying problems." He checked his watch with exaggerated care. "If you'll excuse me, I have a business to run." As he walked away, Margaret placed a restraining hand on Eleanor's arm. "Come on, Eleanor. We've seen enough." That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch watching a spectacular sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The beauty contrasted sharply with her troubled thoughts. The construction had continued until dusk, the noise clearly distressing to Amber, who had spent much of the day hiding in her den despite Duke's efforts to coax her out. The sound of a vehicle approaching pulled Eleanor from her reverie. Dr. Harris's truck came into view, followed by Dr. Chen's government SUV. Eleanor hadn't expected them until their scheduled visit next week. "We came as soon as we heard," Dr. Harris explained as they approached the porch. "Margaret called my office." Dr. Chen looked troubled, her usual professional detachment replaced by evident concern. "Mrs. Caldwell, this development could significantly impact our rehabilitation plan for Amber." Eleanor led them toward the enclosure, where Duke greeted them with restrained dignity. Amber remained partially hidden behind a fallen log, her golden eyes watchful. "She's been like this all day," Eleanor explained. "The noise, the vibrations from the heavy equipment, it's frightened her." Dr. Chun made notes on her tablet. Construction stress alone could set back her progress. But there's a bigger issue. A large-scale poultry operation creates an almost irresistible attraction for a predator like a fox. The sounds, smells, movement, all trigger hunting instincts. "What does this mean for her release plan?" Eleanor asked. Dr. Harris and Dr. Chun exchanged glances. "It complicates things," Dr. Harris admitted. "The original plan was to gradually transition her to the wooded area beyond your property, but if that's being disrupted, and if she's constantly exposed to domestic fowl," Dr. Chen added, "she may develop problematic associations that would make her more likely to raid farms after release." Dr. Chen approached the enclosure fence, studying Amber's behavior. "There's something else that concerns me. Watch how she responds to the construction sounds." As if on cue, the distant sound of machinery starting up again drifted across the property. Amber immediately flattened herself against the ground, her ears pressed back in fear. "That's a trauma response," Dr. Chen explained. "Consistent with an animal that's had negative experiences with similar sounds before." The poachers, Eleanor realized. Sheriff Goodwin mentioned they used machinery to access the restricted areas. Dr. Chen nodded grimly. "It's possible Amber associates those sounds with whatever happened to her mother and siblings." The implications settled heavily over the group. Duke moved closer to Amber, positioning himself between her and the source of the disturbing sounds with a protective stance that seemed to convey both reassurance and vigilance. "What options do we have?" Eleanor asked. Dr. Chen sighed. "The Wildlife Center in Springfield is one option, but given her unique socialization with Duke, the transition would be difficult. There's another possibility, a larger wildlife rehabilitation property near the state park, about 50 miles north. It's more remote, with better natural habitat for gradual reintroduction to the wild. But that would mean..." Eleanor couldn't finish the sentence. Separating her from Duke, Dr. Harris confirmed softly. "And from you, Eleanor." The thought sent a sharp pain through Eleanor's chest. She'd always known this day would come, but not like this. Not forced by Edward Johnson's manipulations. "Could we wait?" she asked. "The council gave us 6 months. We still have time to prepare her properly." Dr. Chen looked sympathetic but firm. "Under normal circumstances, yes. But with construction moving at this pace and chicken houses going up so close to your property, Amber's rehabilitation is already being compromised. The longer we wait, the more difficult the transition will become." As darkness fell completely, they agreed to reconvene in a few days after Dr. Chun could make arrangements with the northern facility. Eleanor watched their vehicles disappear down the driveway, then returned to the enclosure where Duke and Amber had settled for the night. The fox pup pressed close against the dog's side, as if drawing strength from his steady presence. "What am I going to do?" Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to them. Inside, the phone was ringing when she entered. Eleanor picked it up to hear Sheriff Goodwin's gruff voice. "Eleanor, glad I caught you. Got some news you should know about." "About Edward Johnson's expansion?" Eleanor asked wearily. "Not directly, though that's raising eyebrows at the county level," Goodwin replied. "It's about those poachers we caught. One of them agreed to a plea deal. He's talking now." Eleanor's grip tightened on the phone. "And he claims they were hired specifically to clear predators from that area," Goodwin said carefully. "Particularly foxes. Said their employer was very focused on eliminating the fox population." "Did he name names?" Eleanor held her breath. "Not yet," Goodwin admitted. "But he mentioned delivery of pelts to a farm property in Mapleton. We're getting a warrant to investigate further." After hanging up, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, the pieces falling into a troubling pattern. Edward's determination to acquire her land, his sudden expansion, the targeted poaching of foxes, it all pointed to a coordinated effort, with Amber and Eleanor caught in the crossfire. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the kitchen in stark white light. The storm that had threatened all week was finally approaching. Eleanor moved to secure windows and doors as the wind began to pick up, whistling through the old farmhouse's eaves. Outside, she could hear Duke barking, not his usual alert bark, but something more urgent. Eleanor grabbed a flashlight and hurried onto the porch just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. The beam of her flashlight cut through the gathering darkness toward the enclosure. Duke stood at the fence, barking toward the property line where Edward's construction site lay. Amber was nowhere to be seen. "Duke," Eleanor called, racing down the steps despite the rain now falling in earnest. "What is it, boy?" As she approached, lightning flashed again, providing a momentary glimpse of movement along the fence line. Eleanor gasped, raising her flashlight. The enclosure gate was open, swinging in the rising wind. "Amber," she cried, frantically scanning the area. Had the fox escaped? But no. There in the back corner, she spotted Amber's distinctive form, huddled in her den, watching the open gate with evident confusion and fear. Eleanor's relief was short-lived as the implications sank in. Someone had deliberately opened the gate, an attempt to release Amber, exposing her to danger and potentially creating the very situation Edward Johnson had warned about, a predator threatening his livestock. As thunder cracked overhead and rain poured down in sheets, Eleanor secured the gate with trembling hands. Duke continued barking toward the darkness beyond the property line, where the half-constructed chicken houses loomed like skeletal sentinels in the stormy night. The battle for Amber's future, and perhaps for Eleanor's farm itself, had escalated beyond town council meetings and neighborly disputes. Someone was willing to cross lines Eleanor had never anticipated, playing a dangerous game with lives both human and animal. Soaked to the skin, Eleanor stood in the downpour, her hand resting on Duke's wet fur as he finally quieted. Amber remained in her den, safe for now. But as lightning illuminated the dramatic scene once more, Eleanor knew with certainty that tonight's storm was merely a prelude to the greater conflict brewing on the boundaries of her once peaceful farm. August brought no relief from the heat. Fields that should have been lush with midsummer growth instead lay parched and stunted, the county's drought now officially classified as severe. Water restrictions had been implemented throughout Mapleton, exempting only agricultural use deemed essential. The tense atmosphere in town mirrored the pressure building in the cloudless sky, everyone waiting for something to break. Eleanor wiped sweat from her brow as she filled Amber's water pool, now a necessity in the unrelenting heat. At nearly 5 months old, the fox had grown remarkably, her juvenile awkwardness giving way to the sleek, efficient movements of a maturing predator. Her russet coat had darkened to a rich auburn, the white tip of her tail a flash of contrast when she darted through the undergrowth of her enclosure. "She's getting restless," Eleanor observed to Dr. Harris, who had come for his weekly checkup. "More active at dawn and dusk, less interested in our presence." The veterinarian nodded approvingly as he watched Amber practice pouncing on a grasshopper. "Those are all positive signs from a rehabilitation standpoint. Her natural instincts are asserting themselves." Eleanor's heart contracted painfully. "She's preparing to leave us, isn't she?" In the wild, this would be when her mother would be showing her larger hunting territories, teaching her to establish her own range, Dr. Harris confirmed gently. "Duke seems to understand this, even if we struggle with it." Indeed, Duke's behavior had subtly shifted in recent weeks. Though still protective, he now spent more time observing Amber from a distance, intervening less in her explorations. When she successfully caught prey, he no longer rushed to her side, but watched with what Eleanor could only describe as satisfaction from afar. "It's remarkable how he adapts his behavior to her changing needs," Dr. Harris commented, "almost as if he intuitively understands the rehabilitation process better than we do." Their conversation was interrupted by Margaret's sedan pulling into the driveway, gravel crunching under its tires. Eleanor was surprised to see Sheriff Goodwin in the passenger seat. The grim expressions on both their faces sent a chill through her despite the oppressive heat. "What's happened?" she asked as they approached. "You need to see this." Margaret said without preamble, handing Eleanor a copy of the Mapleton Gazette. The small weekly newspaper rarely contained anything more controversial than disagreements over parade routes or school board decisions. The headline made Eleanor's breath catch. Expansion Controversy. Wildlife at Center of Property Dispute. Beneath it was a photo of her farm, clearly taken with a telephoto lens, showing Duke and Amber in their enclosure. Page 3. Sheriff Goodwin directed quietly. Eleanor turned the pages with trembling fingers to find a half-page advertisement sponsored by Concerned Citizens for Responsible Land Use. The text outlined alleged dangers of introducing predators near agricultural operations and cited declining property values in areas where wildlife rehabilitation occurred. Though it mentioned no names specifically, the implication was unmistakable. Edward Johnson. Eleanor whispered, anger rising in her chest. He's rallying support, Margaret confirmed. There's a town meeting scheduled for next Thursday about agricultural zoning and wildlife management. Sheriff Goodwin cleared his throat. There's more, Eleanor. We executed that search warrant yesterday. Eleanor looked up sharply. And we found fox pelts on Johnson's property, Goodwin said gravely, in an outbuilding behind his main barn. But he hesitated, frustration evident in his expression. His lawyer claims they were legally purchased from trappers in another county. We can't directly connect them to the poachers we arrested. He's covering his tracks, Eleanor said bitterly. Almost certainly, Goodwin agreed. But he's careful. The pelts have proper tags, paperwork in order. The man knows how to stay just on the right side of the law. Dr. Harris, who had been listening intently, spoke up. What about the gate incident? Any leads there? Sheriff Goodwin shook his head. No fingerprints besides Eleanor's on the latch. No footprints we could cast due to the rain. Without evidence, we can't pursue it. Eleanor felt a familiar helplessness rising within her, the same sensation she'd experienced after Robert's death, when faceless insurance companies and banks had communicated through impersonal letters while her world fell apart. But this time, anger burned alongside it, stronger and more clarifying. So Edward can just continue his campaign against me and Amber without consequences? She demanded. Sheriff Goodwin looked uncomfortable. I've increased patrols past your property, and we're keeping the pressure on those poachers to reveal their employer. But without hard evidence. I understand. Eleanor cut him off. She turned to Dr. Harris. How soon can Dr. Chin arrange the transfer to the northern facility? The veterinarian blinked in surprise. You're considering it now? I may not have a choice, Eleanor said grimly. If Edward is escalating his tactics, Amber might not be safe here much longer. Dr. Harris nodded soberly. I'll call her today. Later that evening, after everyone had departed, Eleanor sat alone on her porch swing, watching the sunset paint the western sky in fiery hues that matched her simmering anger. In the enclosure, Duke and Amber were engaged in one of their training sessions, a complex game that looked part play, part hunting lesson. The distant sound of heavy machinery had become a constant backdrop to their days, along with the distinctive smell of construction that carried on the hot, still air. Edward Johnson's poultry operation was taking shape with alarming speed, the first 2 massive chicken houses nearly complete. The ringing phone drew Eleanor inside. She was unsurprised to hear Dr. Chin's voice. Dr. Harris had obviously wasted no time in contacting her. Mrs. Caldwell, I've spoken with the Northern Rehabilitation Center. The wildlife biologist began without preamble. They can accommodate Amber next week. Their facility has a gradual transition program that would allow her to adapt to a more natural environment while still receiving support. So soon, Eleanor's voice caught. I understand this is difficult, Dr. Chin said, her typically clinical tone softening. But given the escalating situation with your neighbor and Amber's developmental stage, it may be the best timing. She's strong enough now to adapt to the change, but not yet so habituated to Duke that separation would be traumatic. Eleanor closed her eyes, fighting back tears. And Duke? What will this do to him? Dr. Chin hesitated. Animals grieve, Mrs. Caldwell. We can't pretend otherwise. But Duke's role has always been transitional. He's been preparing Amber for independence from the beginning. After agreeing to a transport date the following Tuesday, Eleanor hung up and returned to the porch. The sky had deepened to purple, the first stars appearing overhead. In the enclosure, Duke and Amber had settled side by side on a raised mound where they could survey their territory, their silhouettes forming a poignant tableau against the twilight. For more days, Eleanor whispered to herself. The thought sent a physical pain through her chest. Her reflection was interrupted by headlights turning into her driveway. Eleanor tensed, expecting perhaps Sheriff Goodwin with more bad news. Instead, she recognized Jake Barnes's pickup truck. The hardware store owner approached with an apologetic wave. "Hope I'm not disturbing you, Eleanor. Margaret mentioned you might need some extra security after what happened with the gate." Relief washed over Eleanor. Jake had been one of her most attentive students decades ago, a shy boy with a brilliant mind for mechanics who had inherited his father's store and transformed it into the most respected hardware business in the county. "That's very thoughtful, Jake. I've been worried about leaving the property, even for groceries." Jake rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture Eleanor remembered from his classroom days when he was working up the courage to answer a difficult question. "Actually, several of us are concerned. Edward Johnson's tactics don't sit right with a lot of folks in town, regardless of how they feel about wildlife rehabilitation." From the bed of his truck, Jake unloaded several motion-activated security cameras and a spool of wire. "These are solar-powered and connect to your Wi-Fi. They'll send alerts to your phone if there's movement around the enclosure." Tears sprang to Eleanor's eyes at this unexpected kindness. "Jake, I don't know what to say." "No need to say anything," he replied, already beginning to mount the first camera on a fence post. "Robert helped my dad keep the store afloat during the recession back in '08. Caldwell's and Barnes's look out for each other. With Jake's help, the security system was installed before full darkness fell." He showed Eleanor how to monitor the feeds on her tablet and set up motion alerts on her phone. As he prepared to leave, Jake hesitated on the porch steps. "One more thing you should know, Eleanor. Edward Johnson has been approaching farmers about forming a cooperative poultry association. He's promising better prices if they unite under his leadership. He's consolidating power," Eleanor realized. Jake nodded grimly. "Not everyone's on board, though. My uncle's farm borders yours to the west, and he told Edward to pound sand. Said he didn't want any part of factory farming methods." A flicker of hope kindled in Eleanor's chest. "So the town isn't entirely behind him?" "Mapleton's divided," Jake confirmed. "But you have more friends than you might realize. Just be careful, okay? Edward's got money and influence, but he's also got a temper when crossed." After Jake departed, Eleanor checked the security feeds before heading to bed. The night vision cameras showed the enclosure in ghostly green tones, Duke and Amber curled together in their usual sleeping position. Sleep eluded Eleanor as her mind churned with worry and grief over the impending separation. Around midnight, a sharp alert from her phone jolted her fully awake. One of the cameras had detected movement near the property line. Heart pounding, Eleanor checked the feed to see a figure moving along the fence where her property met Edward's construction site. The image was too distant and dark to identify, but it was clearly someone examining the boundary. Eleanor's finger hovered over Sheriff Goodwin's number, but she hesitated. Without clear evidence of trespassing, would he be able to do anything? And by the time he arrived, the figure would likely be gone. Instead, she pulled on a robe and slippers and quietly made her way downstairs, grabbing a powerful flashlight from the kitchen drawer. On the back porch, she paused to listen. The night was unnaturally still, not even a whisper of wind disturbing the heat-stressed trees. In the enclosure, Duke was now standing at alert, his attention fixed on the same area where Eleanor had seen movement on the camera. Amber remained in their sleeping hollow, watching Duke with evident concern. Eleanor directed her flashlight beam toward the property line, but saw nothing. Still, Duke's continued vigilance confirmed her suspicion. Someone was out there. Summoning her courage, Eleanor called out, "I know you're there. The police have been notified." A moment of silence followed, then the unmistakable sound of retreating footsteps crashing through undergrowth. A vehicle engine started in the distance, followed by the spray of gravel as it accelerated away. Eleanor's hands trembled as she lowered the flashlight. In the enclosure, Duke had begun to patrol the perimeter, his posture alert and protective. Amber watched from a distance, her bright eyes reflecting the moonlight. Back inside, Eleanor reviewed the security footage, trying to glean any identifying details, but the figure had remained in shadows, their features indistinguishable. She sent the clips to Sheriff Goodwin with a brief explanation, then sat at her kitchen table, suddenly exhausted yet entirely unable to sleep. The decision crystallized in her mind with unexpected clarity. Tuesday was too far away. Whatever Edward Johnson was planning, he was escalating his efforts. Amber needed to be moved to safety immediately, before something happened that couldn't be undone. With shaking fingers, Eleanor dialed Dr. Chen's number, regardless of the late hour. As the phone rang, she gazed out at the enclosure where Duke continued his vigilant patrol. In 4 days, she would have to shatter the bond that had healed them both. The thought was almost unbearable, but Eleanor steeled herself with the knowledge that she was doing what was necessary, not just for Amber's rehabilitation, but now for her very survival. Outside, heat lightning flashed silently across the horizon, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark relief. The half-built chicken houses, the parched fields, and the enclosure where an unlikely family faced its final days together under a sky that promised rain but never delivered. Dawn broke with uncharacteristic cloud cover, a teasing suggestion of the rain that Mapleton had been denied for weeks. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, shoulders tight with exhaustion after a night spent largely awake. The coffee in her mug had grown cold, forgotten as she watched the enclosure where Duke and Amber were sharing what would be one of their last mornings together. Dr. Chun had answered Eleanor's midnight call with surprising understanding. After reviewing the security footage Eleanor forwarded, the wildlife biologist agreed that expediting Amber's transfer was prudent. She would arrive by noon with the specialized transport carrier and necessary documentation. "It's happening today," Eleanor whispered to herself, the reality still not fully penetrating her weary mind. She had known this moment would come eventually, had prepared for it intellectually, but the sudden acceleration left her feeling ambushed by grief. The sound of tires on gravel pulled her from her thoughts. Margaret's sedan appeared, followed by Dr. Harris's truck. Eleanor had called them both at first light, needing the support of the few people who truly understood what this day meant. "Oh, Eleanor." Margaret enveloped her in a tight embrace the moment she stepped inside. "Are you certain this can't wait? Perhaps with the security cameras, we can't take that risk," Eleanor interrupted gently, disengaging from her friend's arms. Whoever was prowling around last night might come back with more than just curiosity. Dr. Harris set his medical bag on the counter. "I've prepared a mild sedative for Amber for the journey. It won't put her to sleep completely, but will keep her calm during transport." Eleanor nodded, her throat too tight for words. The veterinarian placed a compassionate hand on her shoulder. "You're doing the right thing, Eleanor. For both of them." Eleanor managed a weak smile. "My head knows that. It's convincing my heart that's the challenge." Together, they moved to the back porch to watch Duke and Amber in the soft morning light. The fox, now sleek and confident at 5 months old, was practicing her pouncing technique on a clump of swaying grass, while Duke observed from a few yards away, his intelligent eyes tracking her every movement. "Look at her," Dr. Harris said softly. "Strong, agile, those instincts fully awakened. Duke has done his job remarkably well. And now I have to separate them," Eleanor replied, unable to keep the anguish from her voice. Margaret linked her arm through Eleanor's. "You've given them both something precious." Duke got to fulfill his paternal instincts, and Amber received the protection and guidance she needed to survive. Their story doesn't end today. Eleanor was about to respond when her phone chimed with a security alert. The camera overlooking the driveway showed Sheriff Goodwin's patrol car approaching, followed by a county animal control vehicle she didn't recognize. "That's odd," she frowned. "Dr. Chun said she'd be here at noon, and she drives a state wildlife truck." Dr. Harris's expression darkened. "I don't like this. Animal control has no jurisdiction over wildlife rehabilitation cases." They hurried around to the front of the house as Sheriff Goodwin emerged from his vehicle, his face troubled. From the animal control truck stepped Edward Johnson, followed by a man in an official-looking uniform. "Ray," Eleanor called, ice forming in her stomach. "What's going on?" Sheriff Goodwin approached with evident discomfort. "Eleanor, I'm sorry to do this, but Mr. Johnson has filed a formal complaint with the County Animal Control Department. This is Officer Walters." The uniformed man stepped forward, his expression professionally neutral. "Mrs. Caldwell, we've received reports of potential wildlife management violations on your property. I have a warrant to inspect the situation." Eleanor felt her friends stiffen beside her. There are no violations, she stated firmly. Dr. Harris and Dr. Chun from the State Wildlife Department have overseen this rehabilitation project from the beginning. All paperwork is in order. Edward Johnson spoke up, his voice carrying false concern. After witnessing suspicious activity last night, we're concerned the fox may be improperly contained. As a neighbor with livestock at risk, I have a right to ensure community safety. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. You were on my property last night? You were the one on the security footage. Edward's expression didn't change. I was inspecting the boundary fence from my side of the property line, which is entirely within my rights. Officer Walters, Dr. Harris intervened, his professional authority evident in his tone. I can provide all documentation showing this rehabilitation project is properly sanctioned. Additionally, Dr. Lydia Chun from the State Wildlife Department is en route specifically to transfer the animal to a permanent wildlife facility today. Officer Walters hesitated, clearly not having expected this level of professional oversight. He glanced at Sheriff Goodwin, who gave an almost imperceptible nod. I'd like to review that documentation, Walters said, his tone less confrontational. And I'll need to inspect the enclosure to verify it meets containment standards. Of course, Eleanor agreed, relief washing through her. Everything is in order. Edward Johnson's jaw tightened visibly. The county ordinance clearly states that wild predators cannot be kept within 1 mile of livestock operations. My chicken houses are now operational, which puts this property in violation. Those ordinances have exceptions for licensed wildlife rehabilitation, Sheriff Goodwin pointed out, speaking for the first time, which is why I suggested we wait for Dr. Chun to arrive before taking any action. The standoff was interrupted by Duke's sudden, alert barking from the enclosure behind the house. All heads turned at the sound. That's Duke's warning bark, Eleanor said, instantly concerned. Something's wrong. She rushed toward the backyard, the others following close behind. As they rounded the corner of the house, Eleanor stopped abruptly, her hand flying to her mouth. The enclosure gate stood open. No, she whispered, breaking into a run. No, no, no. Duke was inside the enclosure, pacing anxiously, his barking now continuous and distressed. Amber was nowhere to be seen. She's gone, Eleanor gasped, reaching the open gate. Amber's gone. Sheriff Goodwin immediately took charge, pulling out his radio to call for backup while scanning the surroundings with practiced eyes. When was the last time you saw her? Just 20 minutes ago, Dr. Harris replied, examining the gate latch. Eleanor, did you come out here before we arrived? No. Eleanor shook her head vehemently. And the security system didn't alert me to any movement here. Officer Walters was examining the ground near the gate. Looks like the camera was repositioned. He pointed to the nearest security camera, now angled away from the gate area. Someone knew what they were doing. Eleanor's gaze snapped to Edward Johnson, who stood back from the group, his expression unreadable. This was deliberate, she accused. You wanted her released so you'd have an excuse to hunt her down. Edward raised his hands defensively. That's an outrageous accusation. I came here with Officer Walters to ensure proper containment, not to cause a release. Sheriff Goodwin stepped between them. Let's focus on finding the fox before throwing accusations. She can't have gone far. Duke's anxious pacing suddenly stopped. The German shepherd's ears perked forward, his attention fixed on the distant tree line that marked the boundary between Eleanor's property and the protected forest beyond. With a determined bark, he charged toward the still open gate. Duke, no, Eleanor cried, but the dog was already past her, moving with surprising speed toward the trees. He's tracking her, Dr. Harris realized. He knows which way she went. Without hesitation, Eleanor began following Duke, her earlier exhaustion forgotten in the rush of adrenaline. Behind her, she heard Sheriff Goodwin issuing orders and Dr. Harris calling for her to wait, but she pressed on, determined not to lose sight of Duke as he disappeared into the underbrush. The terrain beyond her cultivated fields quickly grew challenging, thicker vegetation, uneven ground, the remnants of old logging trails now overgrown with summer foliage. Eleanor pushed through, scratches forming on her arms from thorny brambles, her house slippers entirely inappropriate for the rough terrain. Duke, she called periodically, following the sound of his movement through the undergrowth rather than actually seeing him. The dog was on a mission, his focus absolute as he tracked Amber's scent. Eleanor had no idea how long she had been following Duke when she realized she could hear voices calling her name from somewhere behind. Sheriff Goodwin and the others must be following her trail. She paused briefly, catching her breath, suddenly aware of how far she had come from the house. Ahead, Duke had stopped in a small clearing, his posture alert but no longer frantic. Eleanor approached slowly, her heart pounding. As she reached the dog's side, she gasped softly. Amber stood at the edge of the clearing, her russet fur dappled by the sunlight filtering through the leaves. She wasn't alone. Beside her, nearly identical in coloring but larger and leaner, stood an adult fox, a female with the same distinctive white-tipped tail. Her mother, Eleanor whispered in wonder. "It can't be." Duke whined softly, taking a half-step toward Amber, then stopping, as if uncertain. The younger fox tilted her head, studying both Duke and Eleanor with bright, intelligent eyes that showed no fear, only a wild curiosity. The adult fox, however, regarded them warily, ready to flee at any sudden movement. After a tense moment, she turned and melted back into the undergrowth with silent efficiency. Amber hesitated, looking between her biological mother's retreating form and the unlikely family that had saved her life. Eleanor found herself holding her breath. This was the moment of truth, the culmination of all their efforts to rehabilitate the orphaned pup. Duke seemed to understand the significance as well, his body tense, but making no move to prevent Amber's choice. Amber took a tentative step toward the forest, then paused, turning back to look directly at Duke. The German Shepherd let out a soft whine that broke Eleanor's heart, a sound of both encouragement and goodbye. With graceful, confident movements so different from the trembling pup they had found months ago, Amber bounded into the forest after her mother, her white-tipped tail the last thing visible before she disappeared completely into the wild. Eleanor fell to her knees beside Duke, wrapping her arms around the dog's sturdy neck as tears streamed freely down her face. Duke pressed against her, trembling slightly, his own grief palpable. "You did it, boy," she whispered into his fur. "You gave her back her life. You let her go." The sound of approaching footsteps announced the arrival of Sheriff Goodwin, Dr. Harris, and Margaret, all breathing heavily from the chase. "Eleanor," Margaret called in relief. "Thank goodness, we thought." She stopped abruptly, taking in the scene before her. "What happened?" Dr. Harris crouched beside them, immediately understanding. "Amber, she found her mother," Eleanor said, her voice thick with emotion. "Or her mother found her. They're gone." Sheriff Goodwin scanned the forest edge with professional thoroughness. "Are you certain it was her mother?" "Same markings, same distinctive tail," Eleanor confirmed. "It had to be." Dr. Harris shook his head in amazement. "The odds of that are astronomical. Adult foxes rarely survive poaching attempts, and for her to find her way to Amber after all this time. It's like something from a storybook," Margaret whispered. Eleanor stroked Duke's head as the dog continued to gaze at the spot where Amber had disappeared. "It's what we were working toward all along," she said softly, "returning her to where she belongs. I just didn't expect it to happen this way." Sheriff Goodwin helped Eleanor to her feet. "We should head back. Edward and that animal control officer are still at your property, and I don't trust Johnson alone there." The walk back was much slower than the frantic chase had been, giving Eleanor time to process what had happened. By the time they emerged from the woods onto her property, Dr. Chin's state vehicle had arrived. The wildlife biologist stood talking with Officer Walters while Edward Johnson paced impatiently nearby. "Mrs. Caldwell," Dr. Chin called when she spotted them. "I understand there's been an incident." Eleanor explained what they had witnessed in the forest clearing. Dr. Chin's professional composure slipped momentarily, revealing genuine wonder. "A natural reunion and reintegration," she marveled. "It's the best possible outcome from a wildlife perspective, though the circumstances of the release are concerning." Officer Walters closed his notebook. "Without the fox in custody, there's no violation to document. This case appears to be closed." Edward Johnson's face darkened with poorly concealed frustration. "That animal is still out there, potentially threatening my operation." "That animal," Dr. Chun replied coolly, "is now demonstrably under the care of an adult fox in her natural habitat, well within the protected forest land that predates your chicken houses, Mr. Johnson. Any attempt to harm her would violate state wildlife protection laws." As Edward stalked back to his vehicle, Sheriff Goodwin approached Eleanor. "We'll investigate the enclosure tampering. Someone deliberately released Amber and disabled your security camera. That's criminal trespassing and property damage, at minimum." Eleanor nodded tiredly, the emotional whiplash of the day catching up with her. "Thank you, Ray. But honestly, it doesn't matter anymore." "Doesn't matter?" Margaret looked shocked. "Amber is where she belongs," Eleanor explained, watching Duke as he stood gazing toward the forest. "Despite whoever opened that gate and their intentions, the outcome is what we've been working toward all along." Dr. Harris checked his watch. "I should get back to the clinic, but I'll stop by this evening to check on Duke. This transition will be difficult for him." As the various vehicles departed one by one, Eleanor and Duke remained in the yard, both seemingly reluctant to return to the now empty enclosure. Margaret was the last to leave, promising to return with dinner later. Eleanor sank onto the porch steps, suddenly aware of her scratched arms, dirty clothes, and complete exhaustion. Duke settled beside her, pressing against her leg in a gesture of shared grief and comfort. "It's just us again, boy," she murmured, stroking his gray-flecked muzzle. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a sound that had promised but failed to deliver rain all summer. This time, however, the air held a heaviness that suggested the drought might finally break. Eleanor closed her eyes, feeling the first coolness in the breeze that stirred her silver hair. The letting go had come sooner than expected, in a manner none of them had planned. Yet there was a rightness to it that Eleanor couldn't deny. A wild creature returned to the wild, a natural order restored despite human interference. Duke had completed his mission, transforming from grieving father to successful teacher, guiding Amber back to her true heritage. The first fat raindrop landed on Eleanor's cheek, mingling with a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. She opened her eyes to see dark clouds gathering overhead as more drops began to fall, pattering on the dry earth with increasing frequency. "Come on, Duke," she said softly, rising to her feet. "Let's go inside. It's finally raining." As they turned toward the house, Eleanor caught a final glimpse of the empty enclosure, no longer a place of confinement, but a symbol of transformation, a temporary sanctuary that had served its purpose. The increasing rain seemed to cleanse it, washing away the lingering sadness and replacing it with the promise of renewal. The drought was breaking, just as their unusual family had broken apart. But as Eleanor closed her door against the strengthening storm, she knew with certainty that neither she nor Duke would ever be the same again. Some bonds, once formed, transcended physical presence, continuing to shape and heal long after goodbye. October painted Mapleton in shades of amber and crimson, the drought finally broken by September's merciful rains. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table surrounded by stacks of papers, legal documents, and maps that had occupied her mornings for the past 6 weeks. Beside her, Duke dozed peacefully, occasionally twitching in dreams that Eleanor liked to imagine featured a flash of russet fur and a white-tipped tail. The grandfather clock in the hallway, a wedding gift from Robert's parents 40 years ago, chimed 10 times. Eleanor glanced up, stretching her stiff shoulders. Margaret would arrive soon for their weekly planning session, bringing updates from their growing network of supporters. So much had changed since that rainy August day when Amber had returned to the wild. What had begun as Eleanor's personal battle with Edward Johnson had expanded into a community-wide movement for land conservation and sustainable farming practices. The unexpected catalyst had been the criminal investigation into the enclosure tampering. Sheriff Goodwin had methodically built his case, eventually arresting one of Edward's seasonal workers who confessed to being paid to release Amber and disable the security camera. The worker's testimony led to search warrants that uncovered damning evidence, not just of wildlife harassment, but of multiple environmental violations at Edward's expanding operation. The subsequent coverage in regional newspapers had caught the attention of state environmental agencies and conservation organizations. Suddenly, Eleanor found herself the reluctant figurehead of a cause much larger than one fox pup's rehabilitation. The doorbell's chime pulled Eleanor from her reflection. Duke lifted his head, ears perked forward, but without the anxious alertness that had characterized the weeks following Amber's departure. His grief had been profound, but had gradually softened into a mature dignity that reminded Eleanor of how humans eventually learn to carry their own losses. "Coming," Eleanor called, making her way to the front door where she found not only Margaret, but also Jake Barnes and Dr. Harris waiting on her porch. "We've got news," Margaret announced without preamble, her eyes bright with excitement. "The preliminary injunction has been granted." Eleanor's hand flew to her heart. "The judge ruled in our favor?" Jake nodded, grinning broadly as they moved into the living room. "Edward's expansion is officially halted pending the full environmental impact review. Construction has to stop immediately." "And that's not all," Dr. Harris added, settling into an armchair as Duke greeted him with a gentle nudge. "The State Conservation Department is considering designating the entire forest corridor as a protected wildlife sanctuary, which would permanently prevent development along that boundary." Eleanor sank onto the sofa, momentarily overwhelmed by the implications. "I never imagined it would go this far." "You started something important, Eleanor," Margaret said, sitting beside her friend. "People were ready for a change. They just needed someone to show them it was possible." The Mapleton Conservation Coalition, as their group had come to be called, had grown from a handful of Eleanor's supporters to include dozens of local farmers concerned about Edward's aggressive business practices, environmentalists from neighboring counties, and even former adversaries who'd reconsidered their positions after the full extent of Edward's violations became public. "How is Edward taking the news?" Eleanor asked, unable to completely suppress a hint of satisfaction in her voice. Jake's expression turned serious. "Not well. His investors are getting nervous, and there are rumors the bank might call in some of his loans if the legal battles drag on." "I don't wish financial ruin on anyone," Eleanor said truthfully. "But perhaps this will teach him that there are consequences to putting profit above everything else." Dr. Harris leaned forward, changing the subject. "Have there been any more sightings?" Eleanor knew immediately what he was asking. In the weeks following Amber's return to the wild, there had been occasional glimpses of foxes near the edge of Eleanor's property, always at dawn or dusk, always brief. Whether one of them was Amber remained impossible to confirm, but Eleanor liked to think the young fox sometimes returned to the boundaries of the world where she had been raised. "Nothing definitive," Eleanor replied. "Duke still stops sometimes during our walks, staring into the woods as if he senses something we can't. But it's been almost 2 weeks since the last possible sighting." Dr. Harris nodded thoughtfully. "That's actually a good sign. It means she's fully integrated into her natural habitat, establishing territory further from human activity." After reviewing the latest legal documents and strategizing their next steps, the impromptu meeting concluded. As her friends departed, Eleanor found herself drawn to the back porch where the afternoon sun cast long shadows across her property. The enclosure still stood, though Eleanor had removed the gate and allowed the structure to become more of a garden feature than a containment facility. Duke trotted down the porch steps, making his way toward the old enclosure with purpose. This had become part of their daily routine. The German Shepherd would inspect the area thoroughly, as if checking that everything remained in order should its former occupant ever return. Eleanor followed him, wrapping her cardigan tightly against the autumn chill. Inside the modified space, she had planted native wildflowers and berry bushes that attracted butterflies and birds. A stone bench now sat where Amber's den had been, creating a meditation spot where Eleanor often sat to read or simply watch the changing seasons. She'd hardly recognize it now, would she, Duke? Eleanor mused as the dog completed his inspection. Duke looked up at her, his soulful eyes reflecting an understanding that transcended human-animal boundaries. At nearly 10 years old, gray now dominated his muzzle, and his movements had slowed slightly, but his fundamental nobility remained unchanged. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A County Forest Service truck was making its way up the driveway, an unexpected visitor at this hour. Eleanor met the truck near the front porch, surprised to recognize Dr. Chun emerging from the driver's side. "Dr. Chun, this is unexpected," Eleanor greeted her. They had maintained occasional contact since Amber's departure, but the wildlife biologist rarely made unscheduled visits. "Mrs. Caldwell," Dr. Chun nodded, her typical professional demeanor seeming somehow different today. Lighter, perhaps. "I was conducting a population survey in the protected forest and thought you might be interested in my findings." She retrieved a tablet from her truck and approached, Duke greeting her with a dignified sniff of recognition. We've installed wildlife cameras throughout the forest as part of our ongoing monitoring program, Dr. Chen explained, navigating through files on her tablet. This was captured yesterday morning, about 2 miles into the protected area. She handed the tablet to Eleanor, who gasped softly at the image on the screen. A female fox with distinctive russet fur and the telltale white-tipped tail stood alert near a fallen log, her posture confident and healthy. Though now fully grown, there was something in the tilt of her head, the bright intelligence in her eyes, that was unmistakably familiar. "Amber," Eleanor whispered, her vision blurring with sudden tears. Duke's ears perked forward at the name, and he moved to Eleanor's side, peering at the tablet with evident interest. "We can't be absolutely certain," Dr. Chen cautioned, though her tone suggested she believed otherwise. "But the markings match, and she's in the right territory range." Eleanor swiped to the next image and felt her heart contract. Beside the adult female fox were 3 tiny kits, their fuzzy forms huddled together, eyes barely open to the world. "She has babies," Eleanor breathed, looking up at Dr. Chen in wonder. The biologist nodded, allowing a rare smile. "A healthy litter, approximately 3 weeks old. They have an excellent chance of survival with such a capable mother." Eleanor knelt to show Duke the images. The German shepherd studied the screen intently, his tail beginning a slow, deliberate wag of recognition. "He knows," Eleanor said softly. "He understands what he's seeing." "Dogs are more perceptive than we often give them credit for," Dr. Chen acknowledged, "particularly one with Duke's intelligence and emotional capacity." Eleanor handed the tablet back, wiping tears from her cheeks. "Thank you for sharing this. It means more than I can express." Dr. Chen hesitated, then added, "There's something else you should know. Our surveys indicate the local fox population is rebounding significantly since the poaching activities were curtailed. Your advocacy hasn't just helped one fox, it's potentially saved dozens." After Dr. Chen departed, Eleanor and Duke walked slowly along the edge of her property where it met the protected forest. The late afternoon sun filtered through leaves of gold and orange, creating a cathedral-like effect among the trees. Eleanor found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey of the past 6 months, how finding a trembling fox pup had set in motion events that transformed not only her life, but the entire community. "We've come full circle, haven't we, boy?" she murmured to Duke, who walked steadily beside her. "Amber has her own family now, life continuing as it should." As they reached the furthest corner of the property, Duke suddenly stopped, his attention fixed on something in the dense undergrowth at the forest's edge. Eleanor followed his gaze, but saw nothing unusual among the shadows and fading sunlight. "What is it, Duke?" she asked quietly. The German shepherd remained motionless, alert but not tense, his ears forward in concentration. Then, almost imperceptibly, a slight movement disturbed the undergrowth. Eleanor held her breath as a flash of russet appeared briefly between 2 trees, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Duke made a soft sound in his throat, not a whine or a bark, but a gentle rumble of recognition. Whether it was truly Amber or another fox entirely, Eleanor couldn't know with certainty. But as Duke finally turned away, his posture relaxed and satisfied, she chose to believe that their unlikely daughter had returned, if only for a moment, to acknowledge the family that had prepared her for the life she now led. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, the setting sun painted the western sky in shades of amber and gold that mirrored the autumn landscape. Eleanor felt a profound peace settle over her, the kind that comes with completion, with knowing that a story has reached its natural conclusion while simultaneously beginning again in new forms. Inside, as Eleanor prepared dinner, her phone chimed with a message from Margaret. "Channel 7 wants to interview you tomorrow about the wildlife sanctuary proposal. Ready to be a conservation hero?" Eleanor smiled, shaking her head at the unexpected turns life could take. From isolated widow to community activist, from grieving dog owner to wildlife rehabilitator, each transition had seemed impossible until it was already happening. Duke settled in his usual spot by the kitchen window, his vigilant gaze still occasionally drifting toward the distant forest. Eleanor knew he would always keep watch, would always remember the fox pup who had awakened his dormant paternal instincts and given him purpose when grief had threatened to consume him. Some might say that Eleanor and Duke had saved Amber, But Eleanor knew the truth was more complex and beautiful. They had saved each other, forming a connection that defied natural order, yet somehow restored balance to all their lives. The fox pup, now a mother herself, had been the catalyst for healing that extended far beyond one household to encompass an entire ecosystem. As darkness fell over Mapleton, Eleanor glanced out at her land, no longer merely her isolated refuge, but now a vital link in a protected wildlife corridor that would endure for generations. The town that had once been divided over a fox pup's fate had found a new unity in preserving the natural world that sustained them all. Duke raised his head suddenly, alert to something outside the window. Eleanor joined him, peering into the gathering darkness. There, at the very edge of visibility, a pair of eyes reflected briefly in the porch light before vanishing back into the protective embrace of the forest. "Goodbye, Amber," Eleanor whispered, her hand resting on Duke's sturdy shoulder. "Thank you for everything you taught us." Duke leaned against her leg in silent understanding. Together, they turned back to the warmth of their home, carrying within them the memory of russet fur and wild freedom, and the knowledge that love, in its purest form, always knows when to hold tight and when to let go. Please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and if you've watched this far, comment, "I watched until here," and share your opinion about this story. Oh, and don't forget to watch the next video that appears on the end screen. It's very exciting.